All right, why don't we get started? Good morning, everybody. Like I mentioned, my name is Mario Sanchez and I run training here at Sumo Logic. Today we're going to be covering the Sumo Logic API, and just word of warning, this is not a beginner or session. We assume you know how to do your searches. We assume you know how to do your dashboards and parsing, and we're going to deep dive into the API. We're going to cover a little bit of theory at the beginning, but then we're going to jump into a demo. And Frank Reno, who is part of our customer success team, is going to be running this session. We also have on the phone Latimer Louise, who is part of the customer success team as well. So between the three of us, we hope to be answering all the questions that you guys have. A little bit of housekeeping. As I mentioned before, you are in listen mode only, and this is to minimize the distractions that happen. But if you do have a question, we highly encourage that you send your questions through the question box in your GoTo webinar panel. And if it's something that is relevant to that time, I will, either Latimer or myself, we will interrupt Frank and we'll cover the question. But don't worry, we will also have a Q&A session at the end, so you'll have a chance to ask any other questions as well. But if you have any question that is relevant, by all means, feel free to interrupt, and we'll be more than happy to help out. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Frank Reno, who is one of our customer success managers and definitely a resident knowledgeable in Sumo Logic API. Frank?
Thanks, Mario, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. As Mario mentioned, we're here to talk today about the Sumo Logic API. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the search APIs. We have a couple of different APIs available. We do have APIs available for covering search, two, in fact, that we're going to cover today. We have an API for managing your collectors, which is highly useful when you have lots of different collectors that you want to manage. And we have an API for interacting with dashboards, which is currently in beta right now. So let's talk about some general API details. These things apply to all of our different APIs. And the first thing to talk about is authentication. Your initial request needs to include an HTTP basic authentication header. You can use your username and password or an access-D and access-I key that you generate via Sumo Logic in your settings. API authentications are limited to 15 calls per minute, and multiple requests should use cookies. This will help you circumvent the 15 calls per minute if you need to authenticate more than that. When you make your initial request, it's going to return a cookie containing two attributes, the JSession ID and the AWS ELB. These can then be included in subsequent requests, which is going to reduce your number of authentication calls. Some more details. API requests in general, they're limited to 4 calls per second. All data is sent and received in JSON. And what URL you're going to use depends on your service region. So here's a table to identify your API URL and what service URL that would map to. Let's talk about some errors. If you have an error, your errors are returned with an HTTP status code and the JSON document. The JSON document is going to contain more information about what went wrong in that request or what happened in that request. The general error codes that you'll see are, auth.failed, which means your authentication has failed. Internal error, so there was some kind of internal server error. Unauthorized means there was an incorrect username or password. And service unavailable means the service is not unavailable at the moment. The first API that I want to talk about of the two is our search API. The search API is ideal for fast and non-trivial queries because it is a synchronous API. It does have some limitations, however. Your search must complete within 1 minute or that search will time out, and a maximum of about 100,000 rows will be returned. If you need to get more than 100,000 rows, you'll either have to execute subsequent requests with smaller time ranges or use the search job API, which we're going to talk about in a bit.
Hey, Frank, before you go any further, there is a question from Robert asking, what kind of error do you get for a timeout? And this is from a slide before.
I believe for a timeout on the search API, I believe it will return an internal error, but I will determine that for sure.
Thanks, Frank.
And update the slides. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk about the search API. So your endpoint for the search API is logs/search, and you're going to execute a get method to there. And in that URL, you're going to provide a series of parameters. Only one parameter is required, and that is the Q parameter, which stands for query. And this is the full search that you want to execute. The rest of the parameters are optional. They don't have to be required. They don't have to be provided because they have associated default values. So the from parameter is the start time range for the search that you want to execute. If you do not provide a from parameter, we'll default to minus 15 minutes. So we'll run the search for the last 15 minutes. 2, again, if you don't provide a default, we default to now, and that represents the end of the time range. TZ is for time zone. By default, we'll default to UTC, and the time zone is expected in a standard TX format. And the last is the format that you want to return. By default, it's JSON. However, you can specify text, and the search API will return you a text representation. One thing to point out on the from and to parameters, all time range values, they can be specified in one of two ways. You can specify it in ISO 8601 format, or you can specify it in epic milliseconds. Either one of those two will work. This is just a simple example URL. As you can see, we're executing the query error, and we're specifying our from and to values in ISO 8601 format. So what you'll get back from the search API, this is the sample JSON response document to give you some idea of the structure. You're going to get back your results. And so you're going to get back an array of objects, and each one of those objects is going to represent the results of the query that you executed. One thing I do want to talk about with the search API is that the search API may be deprecated in the future in favor of the search job API. As we discussed, the search API has some limitations that may make it difficult to work with in certain circumstances. So the best practice is to use the search job API where you can. Let's go ahead and talk about that next. So what makes the search job API different? Really what it's doing is it's modeling the asynchronous behavior of a search in the Sumo Logic backend. It is an asynchronous API. When you create a search job, you immediately get back an ID for that search job. You can then use that ID to interact with that search job while that search job is being executed on the backend. The search job also provides the histogram information, which is very useful for you to see the distribution of messages across time. Again, it is an asynchronous API, and it doesn't have the same limitations that the search API has. So let's talk about that. So the first step when you're interacting with the search job API is you're going to need to create a search job. And the endpoint for that is going to be /search/jobs. And this is going to be a post method. You're going to have to provide some headers. You're going to have to provide a content type header of application JSON and an accept header for application JSON. And you're going to have to provide a JSON object, which would be representing these parameters. So very similar to a search, you need to provide a query. One difference I'll point out with this is that every single query here, every single parameter is required, unlike the search API. So you provide the query, it's the full search that you want to execute. You provide the from value and the to value, which are the start and end dates of the time range. And you provide the time zone that you want to execute, again in the same TX format. Time range values, again, also can be specified in either an ISO 8601 format or epic milliseconds. When you create a search job, common status codes you're going to get back are one of three. 202 means your request was accepted and the search job has been created and is processing on the back end. 415 is the most common, is that you forgot to set your content type media to application JSON. 400 is a bad request. This is a generic request by the client. It can mean a lot of different things, when you'll get back more information in that error response as well. Your response header is just going to be a location header, which is going to provide the full URL to interact with that search job. You'll get back a JSON document. Again, that JSON document is going to contain the full URL that you would use to interact, or it's just going to have the ID of the search job that was created. So when you're creating a search job, the most common error reasons that we see is you forgot to specify the query, or your query is invalid, like it has bad syntax. Perhaps the from and to parameters weren't specified. Perhaps the to parameter is before the from time, which doesn't make sense. Perhaps the from and to values, they're in an invalid format. Maybe you didn't remember to do epic milliseconds or ISO 8601. Or the time zone parameter is missing. If any of the above occurred, your response body is going to contain additional information to tell you exactly what went wrong with that. And just a key thing to remember, if you're using quotes within your query, don't forget to escape your query properly. You will need to escape your query. So great, we've created a search job, we've gotten back an ID. Now we need to interact with that search job. And the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to check the status of that. So again, the endpoint is going to be /search/job/ the ID that you got back when you sent the post request. This method is a get method, and again, it just requires the search job ID that you got back. What you're going to get back is this sample JSON document here, where you're going to see the state. You're going to get a message count, which is how many messages are returned. Again, you're going to see those histogram buckets, so you're going to be able to determine the distribution of messages across time. Any errors or warnings would be present, and if your query is doing some kind of aggregation, like a count or a sum, you're going to get back a record count. If your query is just returning message level data, then record count won't be present. So for possible states, there's 4 possible states you can get. First is the job has not started. Second is that it's gathering results. Third would be that it's done gathering results, so it's gotten all the information it needs and the search is done. And last is that the job has been canceled. So message count, again, that's the count of the raw log messages that are returned by the query, and record count is the count of aggregates. Again, if your search does not execute any kind of aggregation operator, then only message count is returned. This is an important note for interacting with the API. Pending errors, pending warnings, and the histogram buckets, all 3 of these things, they're not cumulative. Each request will return that information found since the previous request. So the client is going to have to store and remember those if they're going to be used. You're not going to get the full set back every time. So once you verified that your search job is complete, the state is done gathering results, the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get the data out of there. And there's 2 things you might want to get out. You might want to get the messages out, and you might want to get the records out. So let's talk about getting the messages out. First things first is you have to still provide the search job ID to the search job's endpoint, and in addition, you're going to add messages to it. And this is going to require 2 parameters as well. First is the offset. And the offset is just the starting point of where do you want to start returning your messages from? Do you want to start from the beginning, from the 100th message, from the 5,000th message? Where do you want to start? And you could iterate over that, making subsequent calls to get the full data set. And the limit is how many messages are returned starting from that offset. The maximum value to return is 10,000 messages at a time. So when you're paging through your messages, this is an example of a very simple JSON representation of what you get back. The key I want to call out is you're going to get back 2 lists. You're going to get back a fields. And what fields is fields contains all the fields that are defined for those messages. It's going to tell you the name of the field, what type of data that field contains, and if it's a key field or not. And the next thing is messages. Messages is going to be a list of maps, 1 map for each message, and it's the raw data. The map keys would be represented by the fields. So in order to know what fields are present, that's why you have the fields object there to tell you what fields are present for every one of those messages. Let's talk about paging through records. Again, if you're executing an aggregate query, then you're also going to have records associated to that request. Records works exactly the same as we saw for messages. Same exact parameters are required. The only difference is in the URL. We're asking for the records instead of the messages. Again, we're going to specify the offset, and the offset is where we're going to start and the limit that we're going to return. And again, the maximum value that you're going to get is 10,000 records at a time. The result looks very, very similar to messages. You're going to have a fields, which is going to contain all the list of fields that are defined for each of those records. It's going to provide the name, what type it is, and if it's a key field. And it's also going to contain a list of maps, which are the records themselves. And the keys in that map would be based on what is defined in the fields list. Last thing to interact with the search job API is the notion of deleting a search job. Now, the search ultimately times out, but it is best practice to delete it when it's no longer needed. You're going to use the same endpoint, search /job/search job ID, which is the ID that was generated for that search job, but all you're going to do is do a delete method, and that will clear out that search job in the back end. Once you delete that, those results, those message counts, they're no longer available. So obviously it would be the last thing that you want to do when you know that you're done interacting with that search job. So what I want to do now is I want to give a demo of interacting with the API, and how we're going to do that is we're just going to use the Firefox REST client. It's a very simple REST client to interact with RESTful web APIs. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to interact with the search job API. So if we look here, we're going to do a GET request to our service URL endpoint, and we're just providing the query parameter, which is going to be a count of errors. The important thing to note is that we're not providing a from value, and we're not providing a to value. So as a result of that, this query is going to run by default for the last 15 minutes. If we look at our headers, I have set the content type header for application JSON, and I have set my authorization header using my username and password. Again, all interaction needs to happen with that, and you need to always provide an authentication header, unless you're reusing from the initial request, in which case you can reuse the cookies. So let's go ahead and execute this. We can see that we got back a 200, so our message was accepted. And if we go in, we got back our results. And again, we're just doing a simple aggregation, so we're only expecting one field. And in this case, we got back 1,361 results for error for the last 15 minutes. Another example here, the only thing I've changed is I've added from values and I've added to values, and I'm doing 1 minute between 10 a.m. this morning and 10:01 this morning. We're doing the same thing, error count. Again, same structure as far as my headers go. And when we execute that, we now got back 106 results. So this is how you would interact with the search API. Again, the main parameters you're concerned with is the error, from and time, from and to time, and then if you need to specify a time zone, there's a time zone operator that you can specify as well. So that's it for the search API. Let's talk about the search job API. So what I have here is we're going to do a post to the search job endpoint. Again, I set all of my headers appropriately that I need, and I've got my body, my JSON body that I'm gonna post. Remember, every search job requires these 4 parameters, and there are no default values, so you must set them at all times. So what I got is, again, we're doing the same query, an error count. We're looking at one particular day for 1 minute, and I'm looking for this data from the Pacific time zone. We're going to send that. Notice that I immediately got back a response. So what this means is I get back a response with what the search job ID, and on the back end, because it's asynchronous, the system is going through and processing that search. I can see the URL that I need to fully interact with it, or I can just take the ID. Now let's go ahead and see what the state of that is. I'm going to change to a GET, and I'm going to add that ID to the end. So now what I'm doing is I'm checking the status of that search job and seeing where it's at. Now if we go over and we format this a bit, I can see that I get no errors, no warnings. I've got my histogram buckets. Again, it's telling me how many messages were found from this start time up to that length, and I can see the distribution of all of my messages. I can see that I got back 1 record, which I expected because I was just doing a simple count for 100 messages, and I can also see that it's done gathering the results. Now that it's done gathering the results, I'm able to interact more with that search. So let's take a look at the messages first. So again, your endpoint is going to be the search jobs with the ID and include the messages. You need to provide an offset parameter, which will start at the first. And you need to provide a limit parameter, which is how many records you want to return. So let's go ahead and just do 2 messages. So as you can see back, we get back a messages object, and it contains a list of 2 entries. Each one is a map. Each map represents the message, and I get to see all the different fields that are present on there. And if I scroll down, I've also got my fields, which tells me every field that's present, and it tells me the data type of that field. Okay. Again, if we're going to now look at the records, it is the exact same thing. Again, these offset and limit are always required. Even though we know there's only 1 record, it's still required for us to provide the offset and the limit. I'll send those over. And I can see that I get back my records object, which contains Oops. This is an example of what you'll get if you specify a limit. If you forget to specify offset or limit, your error code is going to tell you a little bit what's going wrong. Most of the error messages are pretty prescriptive, and they're pretty much going to tell you what's going wrong. Okay, that's great. So now what we want to do is we're done with that search job. We've interacted with it. Let's go ahead and delete that search job. So again, this time, very similar to the GET request, you just provide search jobs and the ID. Only this time you want to do a delete request. I can see I got back the same ID. My response was accepted. If I now try and go interact with that again, I can see I get a 404, and it's because the search job ID is invalid. We've deleted that job.
Frank, let me interrupt you for a second. This is fantastic, by the way. Clearly, you were using a very simple just a count of errors. Tepan had a question around what does a query look like if you want to look at something a little more complex? For example, if I have my query contain a couple of collector selections and a few parse methods, and I don't know if your data supports it, but perhaps you can talk a little bit about what the query would look like.
Sure. The one thing to answer that question as simply as possible, any query you can execute in the UI, the same exact query can be executed in the API. It doesn't matter. There are no limitations on what kind of queries you can run from the UI versus you can run from the API. So you could do anything. You could run, let's see here. So let's say if I have a particular source category, which I don't know anything is defined in this instance, but I could specify whatever source category I want. I can add in any parsing that I need to. I can add in any operators. Any query that you can run from the UI would look exactly the same in the API. No differences.
Great. Super. Thanks, Frank. Another question from Robert. He's asking, what is a use case for deleting a finished job?
It's just best practice to keep things clean. Ultimately, the jobs do time out, but if you know that you're done with the job, you can delete the job so that it can't be interacted with again.
Super. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right.
For now.
So back to the slides. A few things that I want to talk about that we have. So we do have some pre-built libraries that work with different languages that you can use. So the first is we do have a Java client. It's available on Maven Central. You can add it to your POM and install it. I've provided a link to the documentation, but this allows you to interact with our API via Java. And we also have a Python client library, which is useful for interacting with the API via Python. Just some useful resources for you guys to be aware of. Our documentation pretty much lives on our GitHub wiki. There is also some documentation in our standard documentation as well. We do have a community forum specific for the API where you can go post any questions or problems or concerns you're having with the API. And in addition, there's a general email, api@sumologic.com. If you're having problems or experiencing issues or have questions, you can always email api@sumologic.com as well. And that concludes the presentation today, folks. Mario, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. I'm going to open it up to questions. And one of the first questions is, can I get a copy of these slides? And yes, Robert, for you and everybody else on this call, I'm going to post not only the slides, but the recording of this session as well. And I'll make sure that I email each one of you where it's going to sit. Any other questions from the audience? Let's see, there's another question coming in. Frank, the question is, what about results more than 100,000?
So for the search API, again, you're limited to result. You're limited to 100,000 results. So if you need to, you can't get back more results. So your only option for the search API is to execute subsequent requests with smaller time frames, or use the search job API, which doesn't have the same limitations. So you can get back more than 100,000 results with the search job API.
Super. Thank you, Frank. While we wait more from here, actually, there is another question. Is there any limit on how many job queries are run per day via the API?
No, the only limitations that we have is your time. So again, all API authentication requests are limited to 15 calls per minute. And to get around that, you can reuse the cookies from your initial request. And all API calls are limited to 4 calls per second. As long as you stay within the 4 calls per second, you will be fine.
Great. Well, we see if there's any more questions. So I just want to leave you with one more thought for everybody on the phone. If you have any more questions, you can go to sumologic.com/training, and in here you'll see a section for online or self-paced training, in addition to our public instructor-led and private training. But if you go to this online self-paced, you'll see a couple of videos for those who are getting started, or for those of you on the call that are a little more advanced, you can check our video library. This webinar that we just recorded, we're going to post it here as part of our manage, the ability to run through APIs. But you'll see here quite a few videos of the different topics that we've talked about in the past as well. All right. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no questions, I'll make sure I email you a copy of this video. We'll send you the slides as well, and we will make sure that we respond to the question from, I believe, Robert, about the type of error that you get when you have a timeout. Thanks everybody for attending, and thank you, Frank, for taking the time to do this.